At 6:26 in the morning on May 1st, 1960, a lone aircraft lifted off from Peshawar Air Base in Pakistan. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was about to attempt something no one had ever done before. He would fly completely across the Soviet Union, from Pakistan to Norway, photographing the most sensitive military installations in the communist world. His aircraft would cruise at 70,000 feet, more than 13 miles above the Earth, in a realm where the sky turns black and the curvature of the planet becomes visible. At that altitude, Soviet fighters could not reach him. Soviet missiles, he had been assured, could not touch him. He was wrong. 4 hours into the mission, somewhere near the city of Sverdlovsk, deep inside Soviet territory, Powers felt a violent orange flash engulf his aircraft. The tail and wings shattered. The fuselage tumbled end over end through the thin atmosphere. G-forces pinned him forward against the instrument panel. His legs would be severed if he tried to eject. In those desperate seconds, as his aircraft disintegrated around him, Powers fought to escape the cockpit that had become his coffin. He would survive the next 21 months in a Soviet prison. But the era of invulnerable flight above the Iron Curtain died that morning over Sverdlovsk. The aircraft Powers flew that day was the Lockheed U-2, one of the most remarkable flying machines ever built. It was not a fighter. It carried no weapons. It was essentially a powered glider, designed for one purpose only, to fly so high that nothing on Earth could stop it. The U-2 had a wingspan of 80 feet, nearly as wide as a Boeing 707 airliner, yet it weighed only about 11,000 pounds empty. Its wings were so long and thin that they drooped to the ground when the aircraft was parked. Special wheeled carts, called pogos, supported each wingtip during takeoff, falling away as the aircraft lifted into the sky. The U-2 was powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J57P37, a turbojet engine producing approximately 10,500 pounds of thrust. This engine pushed the aircraft to speeds approaching 530 miles per hour and altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet. The aircraft could stay airborne for 9 hours or more, covering more than 2,000 miles on a single mission. Its cameras, developed by optical scientist Dr. James Baker using Perkin-Elmer lenses, could resolve objects as small as 2.5 feet from 60,000 feet. A single mission could produce 4,000 stereoscopic photograph pairs recorded on a mile of ultra-thin Kodak film. The story of the U-2 begins with a problem that haunted American intelligence in the early 1950s. The Soviet Union was a closed society, a vast empire stretching across 11 time zones, and American intelligence knew almost nothing about what was happening inside it. The best photographs of Soviet military installations came from old Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights during World War II. These images were nearly a decade old by 1953 and covered only territory west of the Ural Mountains. Everything beyond that line, including the locations where the Soviets were developing nuclear weapons and intercontinental missiles, remained invisible to Western eyes. The fear that drove the U-2 program was simple and terrifying. American military planners believed the Soviet Union was building a massive fleet of long-range bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons to American cities. They called this the bomber gap. Estimates suggested the Soviets might have 600 or more Myasishchev M4 Bison bombers, aircraft that could strike the continental United States without refueling. If these estimates were accurate, America faced a surprise attack that could kill millions of people with little or no warning. The problem was that no one actually knew how many bombers the Soviets had. Without accurate intelligence, American defense policy was based on guesswork and worst-case assumptions. Conventional reconnaissance methods had failed spectacularly. In January 1956, the Air Force launched Project Genetrix, sending 516 high-altitude balloons carrying cameras across the Soviet Union. The jet stream would carry them over Soviet territory and out to the Pacific where they could be recovered. The results were disastrous. Soviet fighters shot down most of the balloons. Of the 516 launched, only 31 returned usable photographs. The program was cancelled after 4 weeks. The balloons had covered less than 8% of Soviet territory and revealed nothing of strategic value. Clarence Kelly Johnson was the man who would solve this problem. He was Lockheed's legendary chief engineer, a genius of aircraft design who had already created the P-38 Lightning fighter and the F-104 Starfighter. Johnson ran a small, secretive engineering division called the Advanced Development Projects Unit, better known by its nickname, the Skunk Works. The nickname came from a foul-smelling plastics factory located near the original Skunk Works facility. In 1954, Johnson proposed a radical solution to the Soviet intelligence problem. He would build an aircraft that could fly so high that no Soviet weapon could touch it. It would not drift with the winds like a balloon. It would be piloted by a trained aviator who could adjust his course, operate sophisticated cameras, and bring the aircraft home regardless of weather conditions. Johnson's design was designated CL-282. It was essentially an F-104 fuselage, stripped of everything unnecessary, mated to enormous sailplane wings with an aspect ratio of 10.67 to 1. He eliminated conventional landing gear in favor of a bicycle arrangement with tandem wheels fore and aft. Detachable pogo wheels under each wing would support the aircraft during takeoff and then fall away. The structural load limit was set at just 2.5 g, less than half the normal military standard. Manual flight controls replaced hydraulics. There was no ejection seat initially. Every gram saved meant more altitude. Johnson submitted his proposal to the Air Force in May 1954. The reception was disastrous. General Curtis LeMay, the legendary commander of Strategic Air Command, walked out of the briefing. He declared he was not interested in an airplane without wheels or guns. But civilian advisors saw the potential that LeMay missed. Edwin Land, the inventor of Polaroid instant photography, championed the design to CIA Director Allen Dulles. On November 24, 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower personally authorized development of the aircraft under CIA control. The program received the codename Aquatone. Richard Bissell, a Yale-educated economist with no aviation background whatsoever, was appointed to run the program. He was so eager to get work started that he mailed a personal check for $1.25 million to Kelly Johnson's home address in February 1955. The formal contract called for 20 aircraft at a cost of $22.5 million. Johnson delivered all 20 for $19 million, $3.5 million under budget, and ahead of schedule. Johnson selected a dry lake bed in Nevada as the test facility. The site was called Groom Lake, later to become famous under another name, Area 51. Johnson called it Paradise Ranch, hoping the pleasant name would help recruit workers to the remote desert location. The site was perfect for secret testing. It was surrounded by mountains on all sides. The nearest town was more than 100 miles away. The Atomic Energy Commission already controlled the surrounding area for nuclear weapons testing, which meant security infrastructure was already in place. Anyone who stumbled upon the facility could be turned away without explanation. Johnson assigned roughly 50 engineers to the project and promised the first aircraft within 8 months. It was an impossibly aggressive schedule that would have taken a normal defense contractor 3 to 5 years. Johnson worked his team around the clock. He eliminated bureaucratic procedures that slowed conventional military programs. He made decisions on the spot rather than sending them up a chain of command. He personally approved every major design change. The result was an aircraft that went from initial contract to first flight faster than any military aircraft in American history. Johnson delivered. On August 1, 1955, test pilot Tony LaVere was conducting a high-speed taxi test at Groom Lake when Article 341 unexpectedly became airborne at 70 knots. This unplanned liftoff marked the U-2's accidental first flight. LaVere managed to land the aircraft safely. The first planned test flight followed 3 days later on August 4, 1955. The U-2 performed exactly as Johnson had predicted. It could reach altitudes that no other aircraft could match. But reaching 70,000 feet created problems that no aircraft designer had ever faced before. At that altitude, pilots entered an environment barely distinguishable from outer space. The challenge was not just building an airplane that could fly that high. The challenge was keeping the human pilot alive. At 63,000 feet, atmospheric pressure drops to approximately 6.3 kilopascals, roughly 1/16 of sea level pressure. This altitude is called the Armstrong Line, named after Air Force physician Harry George Armstrong. At the Armstrong Line, something terrifying happens to the human body. The boiling point of water drops to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is normal human body temperature. This means that without protection, A pilot's blood, saliva, and tears would literally begin to boil. The condition is called embolism. It produces subcutaneous swelling, vapor bubbles in the bloodstream, and loss of consciousness within 9 to 12 seconds. Death follows in 60 to 90 seconds. The David Clark Company of Worcester, Massachusetts, developed the pressure suits that would protect U-2 pilots from this lethal environment. Early missions used partial pressure suits from the MC series. The MC-3 suit, introduced in 1957, featured a combination capstan system with a full torso bladder extending from shoulders to mid-thigh. These suits were brutally uncomfortable. One of the original U-2 pilots described them as acting like a girdle, skin-tight throughout. When pressurization was lost, external hoses would enlarge and tighten the suit even more, squeezing the pilot like a python. When the larger U-2R cockpit became available in 1967, David Clark introduced the S-1010 full pressure suit, the first designed specifically for the U-2. This suit weighed 31 pounds. Today's pilots wear the S-1034 Pilot Protective Assembly, in service since 1996. Each suit costs approximately $125,000 and is custom fitted to its individual pilot. Every U-2 pilot is assigned 2 suits, and the total inventory remains classified. Preparing for a U-2 mission was an ordeal that began long before the pilot reached the aircraft. For at least 24 hours before a long mission, pilots followed a strict high-protein, low-residue diet. Eggs, lean meats, rice, and noodles were approved. Bread, milk, fruit, and anything that could produce intestinal gas were forbidden. The reason was simple and unpleasant. At reduced atmospheric pressure, intestinal gas expands dramatically. A small amount of gas that would cause mild discomfort at sea level could become agonizing at 70,000 feet. The classic pre-flight meal was steak and eggs. On mission day, a team of 5 or 6 physiological support technicians helped the pilot into the pressure suit. The process resembled astronaut preparation more than anything from conventional military aviation. The pilots themselves were carefully selected from the best aviators in the Air Force. They had to have at least 1,000 hours of flight time. They had to have experience in single-engine jet aircraft. They had to pass psychological evaluations, confirming they could handle extended periods of isolation and stress. Most importantly, they had to resign their military commissions and become civilian employees of the CIA. This was done to provide plausible deniability. If a pilot was captured over Soviet territory, the United States government could claim he was a civilian contractor on a weather research mission, not a military officer conducting espionage. The fiction was thin, but in the world of Cold War intelligence, thin fictions were sometimes all that stood between tense standoffs and open war. Once suited, pilots breathed 100% pure oxygen for a minimum of 1 hour before takeoff. They reclined in a sealed chamber while nitrogen purged from their blood and tissues. This denitrogenation process was identical to the procedure used to prevent decompression sickness in scuba divers. The oxygen chain could never be broken. From the pre-breathing chamber to a portable system in the transport van to the cockpit connection, any interruption could reintroduce nitrogen into the pilot's body and risk the bends at altitude. The U-2's operational debut came on June 20th, 1956, when pilot Carl Overstreet flew from Wiesbaden, West Germany, over Poland and East Germany. This was the first overflight of communist territory. 14 days later, on July 4th, 1956, Hervey Stockman piloted Article 347 from Wiesbaden on the first deep penetration overflight of the Soviet Union. He photographed naval shipyards in Leningrad before returning through the Baltic states. The next day, July 5th, Carmine Vito flew the same aircraft directly over Moscow. It was the only time a U-2 ever flew over the Soviet capital. What the cameras revealed during those first 10 days of authorized overflights transformed American understanding of Soviet military capability. The feared bomber gap did not exist. The massive fleet of Myasishchev M4 Bison bombers that Air Force estimates predicted numbered around 600 simply was not there. The actual count was approximately 93 aircraft, and most of those could not meet their advertised range specifications. The Soviets had been bluffing. At Aviation Day flyovers in Moscow, they had flown the same small group of bombers in circles to make it appear they had more aircraft than they actually possessed. American intelligence analysts had been fooled by a theatrical performance. The U-2 cameras could not be fooled. They counted individual aircraft on runways and in hangars. They measured the dimensions of facilities. They revealed that Soviet strategic aviation was a fraction of what American planners had feared. The intelligence gathered in those 10 days was worth more than everything American spies had collected from the Soviet Union in the previous decade combined. Human intelligence assets inside the Soviet Union were rare and often unreliable. Communications intercepts provided fragments of information that were difficult to interpret. Aerial photography provided certainty. The cameras did not lie. They did not exaggerate. They did not fall victim to Soviet deception operations. They simply recorded what was there. Subsequent missions proved equally valuable. On August 5, 1957, pilot Eugene Buster Edens discovered the Tyuratam missile test site, later known as the Baikonur Cosmodrome. This was the facility where the Soviets would launch Sputnik just 2 months later. Over 24 deep penetration overflights between 1956 and 1960, U-2 cameras covered approximately 15% of Soviet territory and generated nearly 5,500 intelligence reports. The missile gap that Senator John Kennedy wielded as a political weapon against the Eisenhower administration proved as fictitious as the bomber gap. While some media reports suggested Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile superiority reaching as many as 1,500 missiles by 1963, U-2 photography revealed the Soviets possessed approximately 4 operational intercontinental ballistic missiles. 4, not 1,500. But flying at 70,000 feet was not simply a matter of climbing high and pointing a camera. For U-2 pilots, every mission was a battle against physics, physiology, and the constant threat of death. At operational altitude, the margin between stall speed and the speed at which the aircraft would break apart from aerodynamic stress narrowed to as little as 5 to 10 knots. Pilots grimly called this razor-thin envelope the coffin corner. At sea level, a pilot might have a margin of 200 knots between stall and structural limit. At 70,000 feet, that margin shrank to nearly nothing. During high-altitude cruise, the aircraft flew within just a few knots above stall. Exceeding the upper limit risked catastrophic structural failure. The wings could literally tear off the aircraft if the pilot flew too fast or pulled too hard on the controls. Dropping below the stall speed meant the aircraft would stop flying. It would tumble out of the sky, falling thousands of feet before the pilot could regain control, if he could regain control at all. In turns, the outer wing accelerated while the inner wing slowed. The outer wing could approach structural limits while the inner wing simultaneously approached stall. Pilots learned to make only the gentlest turns, banking the aircraft just a few degrees at a time. The aircraft had no autopilot in its early versions. Pilots had to hand-fly every minute of a 9-hour mission, maintaining constant vigilance on airspeed, altitude, and attitude. A moment of inattention could be fatal. Turbulence that would be barely noticeable in a conventional jet could push the U-2 outside its flight envelope. Pilots described flying the aircraft as walking a tightrope across the Grand Canyon, where the slightest misstep meant death. The physical toll accumulated relentlessly over missions lasting 9 hours or more. Pilots breathed dry aviators' oxygen continuously, causing severe dehydration. Sealed inside rubber pressure suits, they sweated profusely, but could not wipe their faces. Outside temperature at altitude hovered around -70 degrees Fahrenheit, but heat buildup inside the pressurized suit during periods of activity could be rapid and incapacitating. Pilots typically lost up to 5% of their body mass during a single mission. Eating required squeezing pureed tube food through a 1/4-inch self-sealing port in the helmet faceplate. The food was manufactured by the U.S. Army Combat Feeding Division at Natick, Massachusetts, which has produced specialized squeeze tube rations for U-2 pilots for more than 60 years. Approved flavors included beef stew, chicken a la king, and chocolate pudding. 3 varieties contained caffeine equivalent to 1 to 3 cups of coffee to combat cognitive fatigue. Drinking involved a squeeze bottle fitted through a port on the right side of the helmet. Male pilots used a custom-molded urine collection device connected through a valve on the suit leg to a container under the cockpit floor. The system frequently failed. As one technician noted, there were more than a few pilots who finished the mission with a very wet foot. Defecation was impossible without ruining the suit, hence the strict pre-mission diet. The most insidious threat was decompression sickness, also known as the bends. Despite pre-breathing protocols, a 1996 survey found that roughly 75% of active and retired U-2 pilots reported at least one episode of decompression sickness during their careers. Since 2001, the problem has worsened dramatically. Between 2002 and 2009, there were 16 confirmed severe cases. 5 were life-threatening. 6 pilots reported persistent neurological symptoms that never fully resolved. The case of Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Henry in 2006 illustrates the terrifying nature of decompression sickness at altitude. During a mission over hostile territory, Henry developed bilateral knee pain that intensified rapidly. Then came headaches, nausea, and hallucinations. He lost the ability to operate the autopilot. He developed blind spots in his vision. His cognitive function degraded to the point where he could barely remember how to fly the aircraft. Then, he vomited into his pressure-sealed helmet. The only way to clear the vomit was to remove the helmet, but removing the helmet at altitude would accelerate his symptoms. He removed it anyway. His squadron commander talked him through 3 hours of disoriented flying and multiple failed landing attempts. Henry finally set the aircraft down through what doctors believe was pure muscle memory. His conscious mind had essentially stopped functioning. He suffered permanent cognitive damage that ended his flying career. Other pilots have experienced symptoms ranging from mild joint pain to complete neurological collapse. Some have suffered strokes at altitude. Others have experienced confusion so severe they could not remember where they were or what they were supposed to be doing. The Air Force has implemented additional pre-breathing protocols and altitude limits, but decompression sickness remains an unavoidable risk of high-altitude flight. The human body simply was not designed to operate at 70,000 feet. The psychological burden compounded the physical strain. U-2 pilots flew completely alone for the entire mission. There was no 2-seat trainer version of the aircraft for its first 15 years of operation. Colonel Merrill Tengersdal, the first and only black female U-2 pilot, described the experience as hearing almost nothing except your own breathing and maybe a bit of hum from the engine. Cold War pilots watched through a periscope like drift sight as Soviet MiG fighters clawed desperately at altitudes thousands of feet below. Pilot Carmine Vito learned after his July 5, 1956, Moscow overflight that 2 MiGs had collided and crashed while attempting to reach his altitude. The Soviet pilots died trying to intercept an aircraft they could never touch. Early U-2 pilots carried cyanide suicide devices in case of capture. The first version was an L pill containing liquid potassium cyanide, lethal in 10 to 15 seconds. Later, pilots received a modified silver dollar containing a saxitoxin-tipped needle. Use of these devices was entirely voluntary. No pilot was ever ordered to take his own life. The devices existed because capture meant interrogation, and interrogation meant revealing everything about the most secret reconnaissance program in American history. The Soviets detected U-2 flights on radar from the very first overflight. This contradicted CIA assurances to President Eisenhower that high-altitude aircraft would be invisible to Soviet tracking systems. But detection and interception were vastly different problems. The MiG-19, the Soviet Union's primary interceptor during the early overflight period, had a service ceiling of approximately 57,400 to 58,700 feet. This left a gap of 10,000 to 13,000 feet below the U-2. Soviet pilots simply could not reach the American aircraft, no matter how hard they tried. The MiG-19SU variant was fitted with a liquid fuel booster rocket specifically to reach U-2 altitudes. The project was abandoned after pilots could not control the aircraft at extreme heights. The MiG-21, entering service in 1959, could reach only 57,400 to 62,000 feet, still not high enough. The Sukhoi Su-9 came closest. On May 1, 1960, Captain Igor Menchukov was ordered airborne in an unarmed Su-9 on what was supposed to be a ferry flight. He had no weapons, no pressure suit, and no combat alert status. His orders were to ram the U-2. It was a suicide mission. The Su-9 reached approximately 65,000 feet in a zoom climb, but controllers cut his afterburner, causing altitude loss, and Menchukov overshot without ever visually acquiring Power's aircraft. The weapon that finally ended the U-2's invulnerability was not an aircraft but a missile. The S-75 Divina, known to NATO as the SA-2 Guideline, entered service in November 1957. It could engage targets at a maximum altitude of 82,000 feet, well above the U-2's operating ceiling. Its first kill came on October 7, 1959, when a Chinese-operated battery destroyed a Taiwanese RB-57D at 65,600 feet near Beijing. The Powers' shootdown 8 months later validated the system and ended manned overflights of the Soviet Union permanently. When Francis Gary Powers was struck by that SA-2 missile near Sverdlovsk, the detonation shattered his aircraft's tail and wings. The missile did not actually hit the aircraft directly. It exploded nearby, and the fragmentation pattern tore through the lightly built airframe like a shotgun blast through paper. G-forces threw him forward. Ejection would have severed his legs against the instrument panel. The ejection seat mechanism required the pilot to retract his legs into the foot stirrups before firing, but the violent tumbling of the aircraft made this impossible. Powers had to get out another way. He released the canopy and struggled free when his oxygen hose snapped. The thin air at altitude would have killed him in seconds, but he was already falling rapidly through thicker atmosphere. He parachuted to Earth from 15,000 feet, landing in a field where Soviet collective farmers quickly surrounded him. He activated the aircraft's self-destruct timer, but could not reach the second switch before being thrown clear of the wreckage. The self-destruct mechanism was designed to be triggered from inside the cockpit. Powers was outside the cockpit when he realized he had not completed the sequence. The timer fizzled without detonating. A total of up to 14 SA-2 missiles were fired during the incident. The Soviet air defense system was in chaos. Radar operators tracked multiple targets as pieces of the U-2 fell through the sky. Interceptor aircraft were scrambled to find the intruder. In the confusion, one of the missiles struck a Soviet MiG-19 piloted by Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov. His aircraft was not transmitting the correct identification friend or foe code because the codes had been recently changed and his aircraft had not been updated. Safronov ejected but died from his injuries shortly after reaching the ground. He was a victim of friendly fire. The Soviets accidentally killed one of their own pilots while trying to bring down the American. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced the shootdown on May 5th, but deliberately concealed that Powers had survived. He was laying a trap. When NASA issued a cover story about a lost weather research plane, Khrushchev sprung his snare on May 7th. He declared publicly that he must tell the world a secret. When he made his first report, he deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well. The diplomatic fallout was immediate. President Eisenhower became the first head of state to publicly acknowledge espionage operations. The Paris 4-Power Summit collapsed on May 17th, ending hopes for Cold War détente. Powers was tried in Moscow, sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, and exchanged on February 10, 1962, at Berlin's Glienicke Bridge for convicted Soviet spy Rudolf Abel. The Cuban Missile Crisis produced the U-2's other defining moments. On October 14, 1962, Major Richard Heiser's U-2 photographs over Cuba revealed SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles at San Cristobal. These photographs triggered the 13-day confrontation that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The missiles Heiser photographed could reach Washington, Dallas, and most major American cities east of the Mississippi River. They could carry nuclear warheads with yields of 1 megaton or more. Their presence 90 miles from Florida represented the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. President John Kennedy convened his executive committee to review the photographs and discuss options. The clarity of the U-2 imagery left no doubt about what the Soviets were doing. Photo interpreters could identify individual missile transporters, erector launchers, and support equipment. They could track construction progress on missile sites from day to day. They could estimate how long it would be before the missiles became operational. This intelligence was essential to Kennedy's decision-making. Without accurate information about Soviet activities, he would have been making decisions in the dark. On October 27th, a day historians call Black Saturday, Major Rudolf Anderson Jr. became the only United States combat casualty of the crisis when 2 SA-2 missiles destroyed his U-2 over Baines, Cuba. Shrapnel pierced his helmet and pressure suit. He died almost instantly. Soviet Lieutenant General Stepan Grechko had ordered the launch without authorization from Moscow against Khrushchev's explicit instructions not to fire on American aircraft. When Kennedy received word of Anderson's death, his advisors expected him to order immediate retaliation against the missile sites that had fired. Kennedy chose restraint. He understood that Anderson's death, while tragic, did not change the fundamental calculation. War with the Soviet Union would kill millions of people. The loss of one pilot, however painful, was not worth that price. Anderson's death may have actually helped resolve the crisis by shocking both sides into recognizing how close they were to catastrophe. Soviet attempts to build their own equivalent of the U-2 failed completely. After recovering Powers' wreckage, the Soviet Union ordered the Beriev Design Bureau to reverse engineer the American aircraft. The project was designated S-13. 5 copies were ordered. Engineers examined every piece of the wreckage, measuring components down to fractions of a millimeter. They analyzed the alloys used in the airframe. They studied the construction techniques that allowed the Americans to build such a light and strong aircraft. The program collapsed by May 1962 before any prototype flew. Soviet metallurgy and manufacturing could not replicate the U-2's ultralight construction. American engineers had developed special aluminum alloys that were both lighter and stronger than anything the Soviets could produce. The manufacturing tolerances required to build wings that could flex without breaking were beyond Soviet capabilities. The engine technology that allowed sustained flight at extreme altitude simply did not exist in the Soviet Union. The legendary designer Andrei Tupolev told Khrushchev that the American aircraft was built at the very edge of what was possible, with weight calculated in grams. He said it was like a dragonfly, and it simply did not match Soviet design traditions of rugged, mass-producible fighters. Soviet aircraft were designed to be built by the thousands in factories staffed by workers of varying skill levels. They were designed to operate from unpaved airstrips in extreme weather. They were designed to be maintained by conscript mechanics with limited training. The U-2 was the opposite of this philosophy. It required highly skilled craftsmen to build and expert pilots to fly. It needed long, paved runways and specialized maintenance facilities. It was a precision instrument, not a mass-produced weapon. The Soviets could copy its shape. They could not copy its essence. The Yakovlev Yak-25RV Mandrake was the Soviets' closest indigenous equivalent. It entered service in 1961, but could not sustain flight above approximately 66,000 feet due to persistent engine flameouts. The aircraft was used primarily as a target drone simulating U-2 flights for Soviet air defense exercises. Only the MiG-25 Foxbat, entering service in 1970, finally gave the Soviet Union an interceptor truly capable of reaching U-2 altitudes. This was a full 14 years after Stockman's first overflight. For more than a decade, American pilots flew where Soviet technology simply could not follow. The U-2 program has claimed the lives of more than 30 pilots across all operators since 1956. The first was Wilburn S. Rose, killed on May 15, 1956, during a training flight at Groom Lake when a jammed pogo wheel caused a stall. 4 CIA pilots died during the U-2 program. Frank Grace was killed on August 31, 1956. Howard Carey followed on September 17, 1956. Eugene Edens died in April 1965. These men are honored with anonymous stars on the CIA Memorial Wall at Langley. Their names remained classified for decades after their deaths. The Taiwan-based Black Cat Squadron lost at least 10 pilots between 1961 and 1974 during 220 missions over and around mainland China. 5 of their aircraft were shot down by SA-2 missiles or Chinese-made HQ-2 variants. These Taiwanese pilots flew knowing that capture meant certain imprisonment or execution. The People's Republic of China considered them enemy combatants engaged in espionage against the motherland. There would be no prisoner exchanges for them, no diplomatic negotiations for their release. Several of those captured spent more than 20 years in Chinese prisons before finally being released when relations between Taiwan and mainland China began to thaw in the 1980s. The Black Cat missions were joint operations between the Republic of China Air Force and the CIA. American intelligence wanted photographs of Chinese nuclear facilities, missile sites, and military installations. Taiwan provided the pilots because American pilots flying over China would have created an international incident of even greater magnitude than the power's shootdown. The Taiwanese pilots were volunteers who understood the risks they faced. They trained at secret facilities in the United States and Texas. They learned to fly the difficult U-2 under the supervision of American instructors. Then they returned to Taiwan to fly missions that the American government could plausibly deny any involvement in. The Black Cat pilots displayed extraordinary courage. They flew over a country with dense anti-aircraft defenses, knowing that their chances of survival if shot down were essentially zero. Several pilots were killed when their aircraft were destroyed at altitude. Others ejected and were captured. One pilot, Major Jack Chang, was shot down on January 10, 1965, and spent nearly 18 years in Chinese captivity before being released in November 1982. The names of the Black Cat pilots who died remained classified for decades. Many of their families did not learn the full circumstances of their deaths until long after the Cold War ended. Recognition for U-2 pilots was slow to come. Francis Gary Powers was initially treated with suspicion by the American public. Many questioned why he had survived rather than self-destructing with his aircraft or taking the cyanide pill. 3 CIA and Air Force boards of inquiry cleared him of any wrongdoing, finding that he had followed orders and acted honorably throughout his captivity. He received the CIA Intelligence Star for Valor in 1965. In 2012, more than 50 years after his mission, he was posthumously awarded the Air Force Silver Star. Major Rudolf Anderson Jr. became the first recipient of the Air Force Cross, awarded posthumously. His memorial in Cleveland Park, Greenville, South Carolina, features 13 granite slabs, representing each day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Powers is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The legacy of the U-2 extends far beyond the Cold War. The aircraft continues to fly operational missions more than 70 years after its first flight. The current U-2S variant is powered by a General Electric F-118 turbofan engine that produces 17,000 pounds of thrust, significantly more than the original J-57. It operates from Beale Air Force Base in California, with forward deployments to RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, Osan Air Base in South Korea, and RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom. The fleet of 27 single-seat aircraft and 4 dual-seat trainers carries synthetic aperture radar, multispectral imaging sensors, and signals intelligence equipment above 70,000 feet on missions exceeding 9 hours. Modern U-2 pilots still wear pressure suits, descended from the original David Clark designs. They still pre-breathe pure oxygen before flight. They still eat high-protein meals and squeeze tube food through ports in their helmets. They still fly alone at altitudes where the sky turns black and the curvature of the Earth becomes visible. The fundamental challenges of high-altitude reconnaissance remain unchanged despite 70 years of technological advancement. The human body is no better adapted to 70,000 feet than it was in 1955. The physics of flight at the edge of space have not changed. Only the sensors and avionics have evolved. In 2020, the U-2 became the first military aircraft to integrate artificial intelligence on an operational mission. The AI system helped manage sensors and identify targets, reducing the cognitive burden on pilots already struggling with the physical demands of high-altitude flight. In 2023, a U-2 monitored the Chinese surveillance balloon as it crossed North America, proving that the aircraft designed to spy on the Soviet Union remains relevant in a new era of great power competition. On August 1, 2025, the 70th anniversary of its first flight, pilot Corey Bartholomew completed a record-setting mission, exceeding 14 hours and 6,000 miles. The Air Force has repeatedly planned retirement for the U-2, most recently scheduling it for fiscal year 2026, but Congress has blocked funding for divestiture each time. The RQ-4 Global Hawk drone, once intended as the U-2's replacement, is itself being retired. The Dragon Lady appears poised to outlast the aircraft designed to replace her. The strategic impact of the U-2 program reshaped Cold War history in ways that are difficult to overstate. The intelligence it gathered debunked both the bomber gap and the missile gap, preventing an arms race of even greater magnitude than the one that actually occurred. When U-2 cameras revealed that the Soviets possessed approximately 4 operational intercontinental ballistic missiles instead of the hundreds that some alarmist reports suggested, American defense policy shifted from panic to measured response. The discovery of the Baikonur cosmodrome gave the United States advance warning of Soviet space and missile capabilities. The photographs of Cuba triggered the response that ultimately forced Khrushchev to withdraw Soviet nuclear weapons from the Western Hemisphere. President Eisenhower understood this calculus intimately. He personally approved each of the 24 Soviet overflights. He weighed every mission against the risk of war. When powers fell from the sky, Eisenhower bore the political consequences. He accepted responsibility for the espionage program publicly, ending the tradition of plausible deniability that had governed intelligence operations for generations. The openness cost him the Paris summit and any hope of improved relations with the Soviet Union before leaving office. But the intelligence the U-2 had gathered in the preceding 4 years gave his successors the accurate picture of Soviet capabilities they needed to navigate the most dangerous period of the Cold War. The men who flew the U-2 paid a staggering physical price for this intelligence. They endured 9-hour missions sealed in pressure suits that squeezed their bodies like pythons. They flew alone at the edge of space in a speed envelope so narrow that a 5-knot error meant death. They watched Soviet fighters fail to reach them, knowing that one day a weapon would be developed that could. They breathed pure oxygen until their mouths cracked and bled. They lost weight, lost fluids, and some of them lost portions of their cognitive function that never returned. They flew knowing that capture meant imprisonment, interrogation, and possible execution. They carried cyanide devices and made peace with the possibility of using them. These pilots were not superhuman. They were test pilots, military aviators, and civilian contractors who volunteered for a mission that pushed the boundaries of what the human body could endure. They came from Air Force fighter squadrons and Navy carrier decks. They trained at a secret base in the Nevada desert and deployed to locations around the world that they could never discuss with their families. Many of them remained unknown to the public for decades after their service. Some died in accidents that were attributed to weather research or equipment malfunctions. Their families received condolence letters that could not explain how their loved ones had actually died. The U-2 story is ultimately one of asymmetric advantage pushed to its absolute human limit. Kelly Johnson's genius was recognizing that an aircraft built to the tolerances of a sailplane, fragile and temperamental and unforgiving, could deliver strategic intelligence no other platform could match. The Soviet Union poured resources into interceptors, rockets, and even a direct copy of the American design. Yet for more than a decade, they could not close a 13,000-foot altitude gap. The cost was borne by the pilots themselves. They flew into a realm where their blood would boil without protection. They endured the bends and the dehydration and the isolation. They watched their comrades die in accidents that could never be publicly explained. The 4 operational Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles that U-2 cameras revealed stand as the program's most consequential. Discovery. That single piece of intelligence prevented decisions based on phantom threats. It showed American leaders that the Soviet Union, for all its bluster and nuclear tests, was not the 10-foot-tall adversary that fearmongers portrayed. The Soviets were dangerous, certainly. They were building weapons and training forces and expanding their influence worldwide. But they were not invincible. They were not 10 years ahead of America in missile technology. They could be deterred, contained, and ultimately outlasted. Today, visitors to the National Air and Space Museum can see a U-2C that flew during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War Museum in Warrenton, Virginia, founded by Francis Gary Powers, Jr., preserves the memory of his father and the other pilots who risked everything for missions that remained classified for decades. At Beale Air Force Base, a new generation of pilots continues to climb into pressure suits and fly to 70,000 feet, carrying on a tradition that began when Kelly Johnson sketched a sailplane with jet engines on the back of an envelope. The Dragon Lady earned her nickname for a reason. She is beautiful and deadly, graceful and unforgiving. She has killed pilots who made small mistakes and rewarded those who flew her with absolute precision. She has outlasted the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and multiple attempts to retire her. 70 years after her first flight, she remains the only aircraft that can do what she was designed to do. Fly alone to the edge of space and bring back the truth about what lies below. The U-2 did not just photograph Soviet missile sites and bomber bases. It changed the way nations understood each other. It proved that accurate intelligence about an adversary's true capabilities is the most powerful instrument of peace a nation can possess. The pilots who flew those missions, enduring physical punishment that would break most people, gave their country something that no amount of military hardware could provide. They gave it certainty. In a nuclear age where miscalculation could mean annihilation, certainty was worth any price.